Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. Shedding further light into what led to the collapse of the Hanoi summit, President Trump said Chairman Kim offered to surrender only 1 or 2 nuclear sites out of 5. Is President Trump sending a signal to North Korea to come up with a better proposal than in Hanoi?
Other things that you haven't talked about, that you haven't written about.
We put in the second uranium enrichment plant.
Exactly.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Eric Brewer, visiting fellow at the Center for a New American Security. At the National Security Council, Mr. Brewer played a lead role coordinating the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy on North Korea. Also joining me, Mr. Daryl Kimball, Executive Director of the Arms Control Association. Mr. Kimball focused his research on nuclear arms control for 3 decades. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome. Now, Daryl, President Trump in an interview said that North Korea in Hanoi only offered to give up 1 to 2 nuclear sites out of 5. So what were his intentions in disclosing this information?
Well, it's hard to understand exactly how President Trump is trying to describe the North Korean nuclear program. Which 5 sites we're talking about, I don't know exactly. I mean, we know that the North Koreans have many nuclear-related sites. They have missile sites. They have chemical weapons-related sites. But I think what the statement illustrates more than anything is that the differences that we saw at the Hanoi summit. We know that North Korea wanted to do decommissioning of Yongbyon, partially denuclearizing in exchange for limited sanctions relief. The United States, on the other hand, wanted a more complete denuclearization offer from the North, and only then would there be sanctions relief. So those are the differences, and I think this recent statement from Donald Trump just further, it gives us a little bit more insight into what went on at Hanoi and what the problem continues to be today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to judge based on President Trump's comments in the interview exactly which sites we're talking about. We know that, North Korea's WMD program is far larger than just 5 sites. So on the one hand, actually, I think the idea that the U.S. is in that meeting was just asking for 5, suggests that there was some flexibility there, and that was actually, it was asking for less than the total amount of North Korea's WMD program as part of that deal. So that perhaps, to me, suggests a little bit more flexibility than perhaps some of the press coverage and other things that have come out since Hanoi would point to. I think it's very difficult, again, to say exactly what those sites are and where they are. Are they just multiple facilities or buildings at Yongbyon, for instance, or do they include other types of WMD? But if I had to guess, I would imagine that the emphasis and the focus was on sites that are involved in producing fissile material for nuclear weapons for North Korea.
Mm-hmm. So when North Korea in a negotiation has minimum of 5 sites but only offer 2 sites, does this suggest that North Korea is going for START-type arms reduction with the United States rather than surrendering all its weapons?
Well, I wouldn't call it START-like because this is not a nuclear weapons negotiating process. But, I mean, it is quite clear that what the North Koreans are looking for is a step-by-step process in which each side takes a concrete action, a verifiable action that builds confidence towards the ultimate goals of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, both are very important to North Korea. It's also formally part of what the United States is pursuing. But they're not going to fully denuclearize until they have confidence the United States is going to be taking the actions they're seeking.
Mm-hmm. And Eric, you've been with several intelligence agencies, DIA, NIC, so you're the best person to tell us about this. How much intelligence does the United States have on North Korea? Do we know everything, or don't we know anything?
Well, obviously, I can't get into any of those details, right, that are classified. But what I would say is that, I mean, look, North Korea is obviously a major priority for the U.S. government, for the U.S. intelligence community. Nuclear weapons are obviously a major priority for the U.S. government, for the intelligence community, and have been for years. So I think it's certainly safe to say we do know a fair bit about North Korea's WMD program, but obviously we don't know everything. And I think what that means and what that results in is putting a lot of focus and importance on having an adequate monitoring and verification mechanism as part of any deal, because U.S. intelligence is going to be a starting point for that and certainly part of that iterative process, but it's going to be critical that we have that monitoring apparatus that fills in those gaps, that's able to provide that warning and able to ensure that North Korea is actually adhering to what it signed up to do.
Mm-hmm. So U.S. having that intelligence, does that give U.S. an upper hand in negotiations with North Korea?
Well, I don't know if it gives us an upper hand, but I agree with Eric that the U.S. intelligence community has a very good idea of where all of the major North Korean facilities are. We probably don't have a 100% knowledge of some of the sites or what is in these sites, how much material, what exactly is going on, and that's why you need to have, at some point, if you're going to have verifiable denuclearization, you need to have on-the-ground experts. I think ideally it's the International Atomic Energy Agency at the nuclear-related sites. But I think one of the things that I think I can add that maybe Eric can't speak about directly is what the United States does know is that there is at least one second uranium enrichment site at Kangsong, not too far from Pyongyang. And this is believed to be a second major uranium enrichment facility. And so I think one of the things that the United States was insisting upon in Hanoi and what Donald Trump might be alluding to is that there is at least this one other major uranium enrichment site that the U.S. wants to be part of the denuclearization process. Mm-hmm.
So President Trump mentioning the 5 nuclear sites, does this set new parameters to the negotiations? Does this force North Korea to re-strategize its negotiating position?
I'm not sure that it does, because I mean, presumably, if we take the president as worded that this is the number of sites that was mentioned, this is something North Korea already knows because it's been talked about at Hanoi. So I'm not sure it actually fundamentally changes the nature of the dynamics. I think what matters actually far more moving forward is whether or not we're going to see further missile tests or other types of provocations by North Korea and how that's going to influence the U.S. position and the U.S. negotiating calculus. I also think it matters the degree to which both sides are willing to be flexible moving forward at the negotiating table. I think both have to move a little bit, right? I think North Korea probably has to move further than the United States, but I think we also need to be thinking about how to phase in certain types of sanctions relief over time as we work towards that deal. And I think signaling at least a willingness to do that, I think, is very important moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree that, both sides need to adjust their negotiating approaches if we're going to have progress. Because what I see here is each side digging in on their positions. We're not going to have progress if they insist upon those positions until the other side comes their way. So, one of the things that can be done is, as Eric said, I think the United States needs to be more willing to offer limited sanctions relief in return for substantial yet not comprehensive denuclearization. The other thing that's going to be important is that the U.S. and North Korea are also going to have to think about how they can lay out a roadmap for the next steps. Mm-hmm. We've heard a lot over the course of the last year and a half about the need for a comprehensive declaration of North Korea's nuclear holdings, its infrastructure, et cetera. I think more important than a declaration is a roadmap about where the two sides are going to go next.
I would agree with that. I think the U.S. government and the administration has been working to try and develop that roadmap, and I think it hasn't made a lot of progress, quite frankly, in part because of North Korea's resistance to that. The question for me is, if you go into those meetings, and whether they be at the working level or higher level, and you do make an effort to develop that roadmap, let's say you can't get to the end. Let's say you can't visualize and finalize those final steps. Is there enough there that allows you to start making progress? I think that's the big question moving forward, and quite frankly, the willingness of both sides to make those steps. Mm-hmm.
And currently there are many urgent international foreign policy agendas: Iran, Venezuela, trade war with China. So does this put the North Korean issue on the back burner?
There are a lot of international crises right now. There certainly are. And I think for the Trump administration, In a normal situation, the American government could deal with all of these simultaneously. In the case of North Korea, I'm concerned that it cannot, because the U.S. approach to North Korea has been so Trump-focused. All of the engagement has been at the presidential level with Kim Jong-un. That's where there's been some progress at Singapore, laying out the four main principles and objectives. So unless we can get working level discussions going, that is between Secretary Pompeo and Foreign Minister Ri or Steve Biegun, the special envoy, and his counterpart, we're not going to see any progress until we have another presidential summit. And then those presidential summits have to be well prepared in order for them to be successful. So I'm concerned that the Trump administration doesn't have the tools, it doesn't have the engagement from the North that is going to be necessary to make progress. And the Trump administration may decide, and President Trump, to focus on some of these other international crises and the upcoming U.S. presidential election, which is obviously a focus for the president.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I do think under most scenarios, the U.S. government can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? I think this administration is capable of handling these multiple crises, or at least keeping them on the agenda, right? And so I don't think that's forcing North Korea to the back burner as much as some other things. Of course, if there's a major conflict in the Middle East, for example, with Iran, or if tensions continue to escalate, you could get to a point where that is starting to drown out a lot of the ability of seniors in the government to focus on other issues. But I do think moving forward, more the larger issues that are sort of slowing this down, I think, are the lack of progress in talks. Mm-hmm. That's really what is what is making this issue difficult to resolve, and what is really pushing this issue to the back burner.
Mm-hmm. President Trump is going to South Korea to meet with President Moon. Would this give an opening to engage with North Korea, give a chance?
I'm not particularly optimistic about that. I mean, who knows? It's possible. You can always have some sort of breakthrough, but I think right now the differences and the roadblocks that are preventing progress are more perhaps fundamental than another leader meeting of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think President Moon has played an enormously important role in helping to facilitate the direct diplomacy between the United States and North Korea. And even though his meeting with Donald Trump is going to be relatively short, I think it is an opportunity for the two to share notes, to share perspectives on what the problems are and how to move forward. I think it's very much in South Korea's national interest, and certainly in President Moon's interest, to try to move the talks ahead again. The South Koreans, I think, have provided some useful ideas in the past. Mm-hmm. They might do so again. So I think it's an important opportunity to think about how to recalibrate the U.S. and ROK position vis-a-vis these discussions with the North.
Mm-hmm. And Eric, do you expect more provocations from North Korea? And do you think U.S. Response to North Korean provocations should change?
I think we should expect more provocations down the line. It's hard to say exactly what they will be, but North Korea has more or less signaled that there's potentially something coming down the road here, especially following the seizure of the Wise Honest. And in terms of the U.S. response, I mean, I think the one thing that I would have liked to see more of is, I think, a little bit greater efforts by the U.S. and South Korea and others to sort of coordinate that messaging and coordinate those statements. And rather than ignore the tests and downplay them, which I understand the logic of, and I get the effort there, but rather than do that, to condemn them and to highlight that this is not acceptable and call on North Korea to return to dialogue and negotiations. I think that would have been the right approach. That would have, I think, helped show that the U.S. and its allies are operating on the same page. And you don't need to go back to fire and fury. You don't need to seek a new UN Security Council resolution, but at least showing that those types of provocations are not going to impact alliance cohesion or compel the United States to come back to the table with some sort of new offer in a way that doesn't serve our interests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we'll leave our conversation here and now watch video for our next discussion.
We are condemning in strongest terms this act of dispossessing of our cargo ship.
If a member state finds North Korean assets or vessels violating the resolutions and carrying out prohibited activity,
North Korea has launched a diplomatic offensive to get its vessel, Wise Honest, back from the United States. North Korean ambassadors engaged in a series of rare press conferences and media interviews criticizing the United States for the seizure of the ship and threatening severe consequences. Now, Daryl, why is North Korea engaged in diplomatic offensive over this case?
Well, the North Koreans have taken great offense to the Wise Honest seizure because I think they recognize this. They interpret this as a ratcheting up of U.S. pressure, even though the seizure probably had its genesis many months ago as part of the ongoing U.S. maximum pressure actions related to the UN Security Council resolutions. The North Koreans also want to make sure that this does not happen again. They don't want to see additional ships seized. And I think they're hoping for the United States to return this ship. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And so I think this incident could be a greater irritant than anyone realizes in jump-starting talks with the North.
Mm-hmm. And Eric, North Korean Ambassador Kim Song said U.S. action is against international law and that UN resolutions condemn extraterritorial jurisdictions and unilateral sanctions. So what do you make of North Korea's claims?
So, I mean, let's back this up a little bit, right? So the Wise Honest was selling North Korean coal, which is illegal under UN Security Council resolutions. UN Security Council resolutions also call upon countries to seize any ships that are involved in those efforts. And so the actions that were undertaken by Indonesia and I think by US under US law are completely consistent with not only UN obligations, but US law as well. And so I think, look, North Korea is going to I think, find issues to pick at, right? And this, of course, the timing is not the best, but this is one of those issues, right? And they're choosing to use this to try and find an issue to apply additional pressure to the U.S., to make it uncomfortable, to make it think that it needs to do something additional to get back to talks. And so I think this is kind of within that vein.
Also, what VOA has discovered is that UN Ambassador Kim Song quoted a convention, UN convention, which was UN Convention on Jurisdictional Immunities of the States and Their Property. A UN spokesperson actually told VOA that this never went into effect. So he was quoting something that never went into force. Now, Daryl, will the Wise Honest case set a precedent and lead to more ship seizures by the United States?
Well, it could, and I would just note that the UN Security Council resolutions probably override any such international law, even if it were in effect. But it could be a precedent. I think, as Eric said, the seizure of the ship is consistent with U.S. and Indonesian obligations under the Security Council resolutions, but all of the states that are trying to enforce these resolutions have made judgments about how and when to enforce. And those judgments have to be coordinated and thought through to make sure that they're not interfering with the diplomatic process and policy efforts to try to bring North Korea to the table and to change North Korea's attitude. So I think it would be unfortunate if there were additional seizures in the near term, because this would exacerbate the tensions that already exist. I think the seizure of the ship sends a message. It sends the message that other states that are in the region need to be very watchful, and they need to enforce the sanctions as best they can. So we'll see if it is, but I hope it is not.
Right. Eric, in the Trump White House, you coordinated efforts to enforce maximum pressure on North Korea. So seeing this Wise Honest case, do you think we're finally seeing some tangible results out of the maximum pressure policy?
So I think the big win for the Wise Honest is not necessarily the seizure by the United States, but it's actually the willingness of the Indonesian government to hold that ship, right, and to pull the cargo off and to detain it. Ultimately, that's sort of the heart of sanctions enforcement and the pressure campaign, right? There was a series of incredibly strong UN Security Council resolutions started in early 2016 and built throughout 2017 that provided some very new and extensive obligations and series of sanctions on sectoral goods that really provided this sort of foundation. And a big part of making sure that those work is that countries understand their obligations and are able to enforce them. So I think that's actually the more important point here and the bigger win that we're ultimately shooting for over the long term. The U.S. government for years now, and especially under the maximum pressure campaign, and I think certainly it continues to do this, is to try and make sure that countries enforce those sanctions. And so that's what I think we saw here, and that's really the most important part, because that is it's an ongoing game of adaptation of all sides, of North Korea and the U.S. and its partners.
And Daryl, I'm curious, because you mentioned in the previous discussion that we should go for partial sanctions relief to North Korea. Are you still supportive of implementing existing sanctions in cases like Wise Honest seizure?
Yes, I am. But I think that if the United States sends a signal to the North that there will be no sanctions relief until there's full denuclearization, we're not going to see progress in preventing the North Koreans from producing more fissile material for nuclear weapons. We could see a return to the ballistic missile testing period of 2016 and 17. So I'm very concerned about the lack of progress in the denuclearization and peace regime talks, and the window of opportunity may not last forever.
Now, Eric, do you think we should tighten the screws even further on North Korea?
So I think if I could wind back the clock a little bit, right? I think I would have preferred, when the president made a decision to engage Kim Jong-un and to have that summit, that rather that make that very quick pivot and I think lessen up the pressure. But I think that change in tone at the top has perhaps taken the foot off the gas a little bit and given a little bit more wiggle room to other countries than I would have liked. So I don't think it's feasible now. It's not wise to I think start really turning the screws on North Korea, because that's gonna upset the diplomatic apple cart, and it's gonna make the U.S. Appear to blame for that, which I don't think is helpful. But I do think we have to start thinking about how do we lay the groundwork now in the event we find ourselves in a position where we are taking additional steps on pressure, and how do we bring the international community along with us? Because I think that's incredibly important. What's not going to work is a unilateral reversion to maximum pressure.
Now we'll end our discussion here and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture of a new bottled water factory recently opened in Pyongyang. In 2016, Chairman Kim ordered the construction of bottled water factories, and 5 new factories have opened ever since. The UN says North Korea lacks clean water nationwide due to inadequate maintenance and lack of electricity. As the bottled waters are costly, there are speculations that they may be intended for exports. Eric?
Well, I'm not sure I would feel comfortable drinking it. That's my takeaway. But of course, these are the types of perhaps measures that are, in terms of things that measures that can be eased and other things like that. I think that this would certainly seem to fall within that realm.
Measures and sanctions relief measures?
Sanctions relief measures and other things that, things that are otherwise beneficial for North Korea that perhaps are not, going to contribute to WMD or are not going to substantially infringe on a lot of the other really tough sectoral sanctions that are in place.
Daryl?
Well, it's a reminder that the North Koreans are people too, and they drink water, they need the basics of life in order to live a happy and productive existence. And so, this also is a sign that Kim Jong-un's priority is to try to better his people. He's in his 30s. He's likely thinking that he's going to be the leader for a long time. I think he probably understands that nuclear weapons and the conflict with the United States is a dead end, and he wants to find a new path. So to me, this is a reminder that ultimately that's probably where he wants to take his country. The question is, how do we get there given where things are today? He's got to make the strategic decision. He does.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Daryl, Eric, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.